The neighbors laughed at the single mother and her son as she dug the ground instead of building a house. When winter came, warm walls saved no one except those who had been laughed at. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Summer arrived without ceremony, slipping into the valley as if it had always been there, thin and fragile, already carrying the promise of its own end. On the frontier, no season was ever taken for granted, but summer was the most deceptive of all. It gave the illusion of abundance and time, of long days that could be stretched and reshaped at will, even as everyone knew, deep down, that it would vanish faster than any other. The settlement lay exposed beneath a wide sky, a scattering of new structures pressed into raw land that still resisted the idea of permanence. The earth was dark and freshly turned, the air filled with the scent of sap, cut timber, and dust warmed by the sun. From dawn to dusk, the place hummed with labor. Men and women worked with a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation, hammering beams into place, lifting walls, setting roofs. Every sound carried across the open ground, the crack of wood splitting, the dull rhythm of mallets, the scrape of saws biting into fresh planks. Smoke rose from temporary fires where meals were cooked quickly and without ceremony, because no one wanted to lose even a single hour of daylight. Here, a house was more than shelter. It was a declaration that one intended to survive the winter, that one belonged to this land and would not be chased away by cold and hunger. Most of the settlers shared the same strategy: build first, build strong, build fast. Walls thick enough to block the wind, roofs angled to shed snow, chimneys tall enough to draw smoke even in heavy storms. Conversations revolved around insulation, about how many logs were needed for a proper stove, about the smartest way to seal gaps between boards. Food was mentioned, of course, but always as something to be dealt with later, once the real work was done. There was a shared belief that a solid house could compensate for any shortage, that warmth alone could keep hardship at bay. At the far edge of the settlement stood a structure that quietly contradicted all of this. It was a house in name only, a skeleton compared to the sturdier buildings rising nearby. Its walls were uneven, some boards still missing, the roof little more than a temporary cover meant to keep out rain rather than snow. There was no chimney yet, no proper stove inside, no sign of the careful detailing that others obsessed over. To anyone passing by, it looked unfinished because it was unfinished, and it stayed that way far longer than seemed reasonable. The woman who lived there did not appear troubled by this. She was neither young nor old, her face shaped by years of weather and effort rather than by time alone. There was a steadiness to her movements that suggested familiarity with hard work, not the frantic energy of someone racing against an unseen clock. She did not measure her days by how much her house resembled those of her neighbors. She measured them by tasks completed quietly, deliberately, away from the center of attention. Her 10-year-old son was almost always with her. He moved with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who had grown accustomed to responsibility early. When she lifted stones, he gathered smaller ones and stacked them nearby. When she marked lines in the soil, he followed, clearing roots and debris with hands already roughened by labor. There was no sense that he was being made to work beyond his years. What he did because it was expected, because it was part of their shared life, and because no one had ever suggested that survival was something to be handled by adults alone. While others worked upward, she worked downward. Not far from her house, a narrow stream curved through the land, its path shaped by subtle shifts in elevation and resistance. The water moved steadily, never rushing, never stagnant, glinting in the sun as it traced an irregular line through grass and stones. She studied it for days before she ever put a shovel to the ground. She walked along its length, watched how it behaved after rain, noted where it slowed and where it cut deeper into the earth. Only then did she choose a spot slightly above the stream's natural course, where the soil was firm and the slope gentle enough to allow control. The first trench she dug drew little attention. Digging was common enough after all. People dug holes for posts, for foundations, for shallow storage pits they planned to deepen later. But as the trench grew longer and narrower, running parallel to the stream instead of directly toward it, curiosity turned into confusion. It was not wide enough to be a root cellar, not deep enough to be a well. It did not seem to serve any obvious purpose. When she continued to extend it, day after day, even as others raised walls and laid beams, the murmurs began. At first, they were mild. A shake of the head here, a raised brow there. Some assumed she would return to her house once she realized how far behind she was falling. Others guessed she was simply misjudging her time, that fear or stubbornness had clouded her priorities. As summer wore on and the trench became more defined, lined with stones she and the boy carried from the surrounding land, the tone shifted. Laughter crept into voices that spoke her name. Jokes were made openly now, no longer softened by politeness. People passing by slowed just long enough to comment on the state of her house, on the wisdom of digging holes when winter would not wait. They spoke as if she were not there, or as if she could not hear them. She did not respond. She rarely even looked up. Her attention remained fixed on the ground, on the way stones fit together, on the slight adjustments needed to keep the trench level from one end to the other. The boy heard the laughter more clearly than she did. Children always did. He stiffened at first, his movements growing sharper, his jaw tightening when voices carried too close. But she never acknowledged it, and eventually neither did he. The work itself demanded focus. Stones had to be placed carefully so they would not shift. The soil needed to be packed down firmly. Mistakes made now would not reveal themselves until it was too late to fix them. As the trench took shape, she began to work on its connection to the stream. This was done with even greater care. She did not divert the main flow. That would have been foolish and dangerous, especially when spring came and the water swelled with melt. Instead, she carved a small channel, narrow enough that it would carry only a fraction of the stream's volume. The water entered the trench gently, moving just fast enough to avoid stagnation, then exited at the far end through another carefully shaped path that returned it to its original course. The system was subtle, almost invisible, unless one knew where to look. When the first trickle of water began to move through the trench, she watched it closely. The boy crouched beside her, fascinated by the way the water darkened the soil and settled between the stones. She adjusted the channel with small changes, adding a rock here, removing a clump of dirt there, until the flow became steady and predictable. Only then did she allow herself a brief moment of stillness, hands resting on her knees, eyes following the path of the water from entry to exit. Summer advanced, and with it came the work of preparing food. While others hunted and harvested, with the vague intention of dealing with preservation later, she treated each piece of meat as if its future mattered more than its present. She brought wooden barrels to the trench, heavy things darkened by age and use. Some were sealed carefully, their lids pressed tight and weighted with stones. Others were left open for now, awaiting their contents. The boy helped guide them into place, his small hands braced against wet wood as they lowered each barrel into the trench, aligning it so it stood upright and stable. From a distance, it looked strange. Barrels half submerged in water, arranged in a narrow line beneath the open sky. It did not resemble any storage method the others recognized. It certainly did not resemble the deep, wide pits they dug for their own supplies. The laughter grew louder, more confident. People spoke of frozen water and spoiled meat, of barrels swept away by unseen forces, of effort wasted on an idea that would fail at the first real frost. She heard none of it as accusation. To her, the sounds blended into the background of summer, no different from the call of birds or the wind through grass. Her attention was elsewhere, rooted in memory. She had known hunger before, not the dramatic kind that came with immediate danger, but the slow, gnawing kind that hollowed people out from the inside. She remembered standing in a house that was warm enough, listening to the wind howl outside, while there was nothing left to eat. She remembered how useless walls felt then, how meaningless a roof was when the body had nothing to draw strength from. This was not something she explained, because explanation had never changed anyone's mind. It was something she acted on, quietly and without spectacle. As autumn crept closer, the contrast between her choices and those of the settlement sharpened. Houses now stood solid and proud, their owners satisfied, even smug, as chimneys began to take shape and doors were reinforced. Her own house remained incomplete, its flaws more obvious with each passing day. Nights grew cooler, and she could feel the change in the air, the subtle tightening that preceded frost. The boy noticed it too, pulling his coat tighter in the mornings, glancing at the sky more often. There were moments, brief and unspoken, when doubt pressed in. Late at night, lying beneath the temporary roof, listening to the sounds of the settlement settling into sleep, she imagined the cold that would come. She imagined snow piling against walls that were not yet finished, wind finding every gap. She imagined the judgment that would come if she had miscalculated. These thoughts did not linger. They were acknowledged and set aside, the way one acknowledged pain during hard labor, without allowing it to dictate the work. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the trench, she and the boy stood together and looked at what they had built. The water moved steadily through its narrow path, reflecting the fading light. The barrels stood silent and heavy, already holding the promise of months to come. The house behind them was still imperfect, still vulnerable, but it existed, and it would have to wait. The first frost came soon after, dusting the ground with a thin, white layer that vanished by midday. It was a warning, nothing more. Around the settlement, people took it as a sign that they had been right to focus on their houses. They lit fires, tested stoves, sealed cracks. She returned to the trench instead, checking the flow of water, making small adjustments, ensuring that nothing had shifted. When snow finally fell in earnest, it did so quietly, covering the land in a uniform blanket that erased the marks of summer labor. Paths disappeared. The trench vanished beneath a smooth layer of white, indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. Only she and the boy knew exactly where it lay. Winter had not yet begun in full, but its shadow stretched long across the settlement. The choices made in summer were now fixed, beyond revision. As the cold deepened and the days shortened, the true value of those choices would soon reveal itself, not in theory or argument, but in the simple, unforgiving arithmetic of survival. The first real snow did not stay, but it changed everything. It hardened the ground in the mornings and softened it again by afternoon, turning work into something slower and more deliberate. The settlement responded by retreating inward. Doors were fitted, roofs reinforced, chimneys tested with cautious fires that sent thin columns of smoke into the pale sky. People spoke more often about warmth now, about sealing gaps and stacking firewood close to their walls. The idea that winter was no longer theoretical settled over the valley like a weight. For her, the snow was not an ending, but a signal. The trench lay hidden beneath a shallow cover of white, but she knew its exact shape as clearly as if it were still exposed. Each morning, Before tending to anything else, she walked its length, brushing away snow where needed, checking that nothing had shifted during the night. The water continued to move beneath the surface, unseen but audible if one listened closely, a faint murmur beneath ice and soil. That sound reassured her more than any finished wall could have. The choice to build horizontally rather than vertically had never been about defiance. It was about understanding how cold worked. Deep cellars, the kind most of the settlers favored, relied on depth alone to protect what lay inside them. They assumed that Earth was an absolute shield, that digging downward was always safer than spreading outward. She had learned otherwise. Earth could betray you when cold settled in slowly, when frost crept down layer by layer and sealed moisture where it lay. Water trapped in deep pits froze solid, expanding, cracking containers, ruining everything it touched. Her trench was different. It did not invite water to stagnate. It guided it. The narrowness forced the flow to remain controlled, never strong enough to erode the walls, never weak enough to stop. She adjusted the channels carefully, sometimes with nothing more than her hands and a flat stone, feeling the resistance of the water, learning its habits. The boy watched and mimicked her movements, understanding without explanation that this was not guesswork. This was attention. They worked in silence most days. Words were unnecessary when the work itself demanded so much focus. The boy learned how to test the stability of a stone by pressing his weight against it, how to recognize soil that would shift later and soil that would hold. His hands grew accustomed to cold water, his fingers red and stiff at first, then steadier. She never hurried him. Speed had no place here. Precision did. As autumn deepened, she began filling the barrels in earnest. Meat was salted carefully, layered with patience that bordered on reverence. Nothing was rushed. Each piece was placed as if it mattered because it did. The open barrel near the front of the trench became the focus of their work, receiving the freshest cuts, the ones that would be needed first. The sealed barrels were left untouched once closed, their contents committed to the long wait ahead. The act of placing food into water unsettled those who watched. Water was something to be kept away from stored food, not embraced. People muttered about rot and contamination, about sickness waiting to happen. They spoke with the confidence of those who had never lost everything at once. She heard enough to understand their fear, but she did not share it. The water was cold and moving, and the barrels were sealed where they needed to be sealed. Air was the enemy here, not water. There were days when she worked alone, the boy occupied elsewhere or resting from the strain. On those days, the doubts crept closer. She felt them in the pause before lowering a heavy lid, in the moment of hesitation, before placing another stone to weight it down. She imagined the water freezing solid, imagined barrels trapped and unreachable, imagined the effort wasted. Each time she tested the flow again, broke thin ice with the handle of her shovel, listened to the water move. The evidence was there. She trusted it. Around her, the settlement's confidence grew louder as their houses neared completion. Doors hung straight. Roofs gleamed with fresh shingles. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys. People began to linger indoors longer, speaking of winter as something they were now ready to endure. The laughter directed at her became less frequent, but sharper when it came, edged with certainty. They saw her unfinished house and assumed the rest of her life was just as unprepared. The boy noticed the difference. He noticed how voices changed when she passed, how eyes followed them longer now, with something like curiosity mixed with judgment. One evening, as they walked back from the trench, he lingered near the house, looking at its thin walls and temporary roof. He did not speak, but she knew what he was thinking. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a brief grounding touch, and guided him inside. There would be time to finish the house later. There would be no time to fix mistakes made underground. The nights grew longer. Frost no longer vanished by midday. The stream's edges stiffened with ice, though its center still moved freely. She adjusted the intake channel slightly, narrowing it further, ensuring the flow remained gentle and constant. At the outflow, she cleared debris daily, making sure nothing obstructed the return of water to its original path. This balance mattered. Too much water would overwhelm the trench. Too little would allow freezing. One evening, as the sun set early and the air sharpened with cold, they placed the last significant addition into the open barrel. It was a heavy piece of meat, carefully prepared, its surface already stiffening from the chill. She knelt beside the trench, her coat pulled tight, her breath visible. The boy knelt beside her, steadying the barrel with both hands. Together, they lowered the meat into the cold water. For a moment she paused, her hand resting on the rim, her eyes closed, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement. This was the last piece. What they had prepared was what they would have. When they stood, the light was fading. The trench looked complete now, as complete as anything ever was. The water flowed, the barrels stood aligned, the earth around them firm and unbroken. Snow began to fall again, light at first, then steadier. They covered the trench carefully, laying boards and earth where needed, disguising it beneath a layer that would soon blend seamlessly with the rest of the land. The first true cold followed quickly. Temperatures dropped sharply, and the settlement retreated fully into its houses. Fires burned constantly now. People spoke less of building and more of enduring. She felt the cold in her own house, felt it slip through cracks and settle near the floor. She added what insulation she could, made do with what she had. It was uncomfortable, sometimes painfully so, but it was temporary. Hunger was not. At night, lying awake, she listened not just to the wind, but to the deeper sounds beneath it. She listened for silence where there should be movement. Each time, faint though it was, she heard it. The quiet, steady sound of water moving through earth and stone. It was not loud enough to be comforting in the usual sense. It was comforting because it existed at all. Winter tightened its grip gradually, not with a single storm, but with a series of small, relentless changes. The ground froze solid. Snow piled higher. Paths became difficult to follow. The stream narrowed, ice thickening along its banks. She checked the trench daily, breaking ice where necessary, adjusting stones with hands numbed by cold. The boy followed her example, learning to work through discomfort without complaint. When she finally allowed herself to step back and observe the settlement as a whole, she saw a pattern emerging. Houses stood firm, but their owners moved differently now. There was less energy in their steps, less confidence in their conversations. They spoke of food more often, counting and recounting what they had stored. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. She did not feel triumph. It was too early for that. And triumph was never the point. What she felt was a steady resolve, a quiet certainty that the choices made in summer were now locked in place. Winter would judge them all soon enough, not by intention or effort, but by results. As the snow continued to fall and the days shortened further, the trench beneath the earth remained unseen, its presence known only to those who had built it. The water continued its slow, deliberate journey from stream to trench and back again, carrying with it the promise that preparation, not appearance, would determine who endured the months ahead. Winter did not arrive with a single decisive blow. It settled into the valley the way a slow illness settles into a body, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. Each morning, the cold lingered longer than the day before. Each night pressed deeper into bone and breath. Snow no longer melted by midday. It stayed, layer upon layer, smoothing the land into something quiet and deceptive, hiding what lay beneath. The settlement adapted outwardly well. Smoke rose from chimneys in steady columns, proof that fires were burning and houses were holding. Doors remained shut most of the day now, opening only briefly to admit someone carrying wood or water. From a distance, it looked as though the strategy had worked. Walls stood firm, roofs carried the weight of snow, wind struck and slid away. The houses did what houses were supposed to do. Inside them, however, something else was beginning to fail. At first it was small things. A jar discovered cracked at the bottom of a cellar. Meat that smelled wrong sooner than expected. Grain dampened by unseen moisture. People blamed chance, then carelessness, then the weather itself. They adjusted, scraped away what was lost, convinced themselves it was nothing serious. There was still food left. There would be enough. There had to be. The woman noticed the shift before anyone spoke of it openly. She noticed the way people lingered longer at their doors before stepping outside, as if reluctant to leave the warmth they had paid for so dearly. She noticed the way conversations shortened, drifting away from confidence and toward calculation. She noticed the quiet glances toward her place, not mocking now, but curious in a way that unsettled those who gave them. Her own days followed a steady rhythm. Each morning she and the boy cleared a path through the snow to the trench. The work had become harder now. The cold bit deeper, numbing fingers within minutes. The earth above the trench had frozen solid, and breaking through it required patience and care. She worked slowly, listening for the sound she had learned to trust. When the thin layer of ice gave way, the water beneath always answered, moving, alive. Steam rose faintly from the dark surface where ice had been broken, a fragile breath against the frozen air. The boy watched it every time, as if expecting one day for it not to appear. Each time it did, his shoulders eased, just a little. They did not open the sealed barrels yet. There was no need. The open one near the front was enough for now. When they lifted its lid, the cold smell of salt and preserved meat rose to meet them, sharp but clean. The contents looked as they should, not frozen into useless hardness, not softened by rot, alive in the way food needed to be to sustain life. She took only what they required, resealed the barrel, weighted it again, and let the water continue its work. The boy carried the pieces back to the house, his steps careful on the packed snow. Inside, the house was cold, colder than most in the settlement. She could feel the difference immediately upon crossing the threshold, the way warmth refused to linger. She fed the fire, layered clothing, adjusted where they slept. It was not comfortable. It was sufficient. And when they ate without rationing beyond what was sensible. That alone made the cold bearable. Elsewhere, the arithmetic of winter was turning grim. Deep cellars, dug with confidence, betrayed their owners. Frost had crept down through the soil, sealing moisture where it lay. Barrels split under pressure. Ice formed where none had been expected. In some houses, the cold reached stored food before people realized it was happening. By the time they noticed, damage had already been done. The settlement did not acknowledge this immediately. Pride delayed recognition longer than hunger ever could. People adjusted meals, stretched portions, spoke of eating less as a temporary measure. They told themselves that the worst of winter was always exaggerated, that things would ease before supplies ran out. Fires burned hotter, wood disappeared faster, and the illusion of control held on by sheer force of will. The woman watched these changes without comment. She did not measure her days by what others were losing, only by what she still had. The trench required constant attention now. Snow pressed down, insulating the earth, but also hiding problems. She checked the intake channel carefully, clearing ice and debris so the flow remained steady. At the outflow, she ensured the water returned to the stream without obstruction. Any blockage could mean stagnation. Any stagnation could mean failure. One morning, after a night of particularly bitter cold, the stream itself appeared frozen from bank to bank. The surface was solid, pale, unbroken. The boy stopped short, fear flashing across his face. She did not hurry. She knelt and pressed her gloved hand against the ice near the trench. She listened. Beneath the frozen skin, the water still moved. Slow, yes, but alive. The system held. That day marked a turning point, though no one announced it. In the settlement, people began to speak of food openly now. There was less laughter, less confidence. Someone mentioned a cellar that had lost half its contents overnight. Another admitted to throwing out meat that had gone bad. These admissions were quiet, almost ashamed, but they spread quickly. Hunger, once abstract, began to feel close. It was around this time that she opened one of the sealed barrels for the first time since autumn. The effort was considerable. The lid had frozen into place, and the weight of stone and ice made it heavy. She and the boy worked together, chipping carefully, levering slowly until the seal broke. Steam rose again, stronger this time, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of preserved meat. Inside, everything was as it should be. The boy stared, silent, his eyes wide. He had trusted the work, trusted her, but seeing the result in the heart of winter changed something in him. This was no longer preparation. It was proof. Word traveled, as it always did. Someone noticed them carrying food back to the house. Someone else noticed the absence of the desperation that now clung to others. The glances became longer, less guarded. People watched her movements from behind doors, from the edges of paths cleared through snow. The laughter that once followed her steps was gone, replaced by something heavier. The first person came not with a request, but with a question. It was framed casually, almost clumsily, about how she managed to keep food from freezing. She answered with actions rather than explanations, gesturing toward the land, the water, the trench hidden beneath snow. The answer did not satisfy because it required acceptance of a mistake already made. More followed, each one closer to admitting what could no longer be denied. Some spoke of hunger in their houses, of children eating less, of meals growing thinner. Others spoke only of curiosity, but the edge of fear was always present. She listened, said little, and returned to her work. It was not yet time. As winter deepened, the difference between houses became stark. Some remained warm but empty, their fires burning against walls that held heat but could not create food. Others, like hers, were colder, simpler, less complete, but sustained by something more fundamental. The settlement felt this imbalance even if it could not yet articulate it. The boy began to understand the weight of what they carried. He moved differently now, more deliberately, more aware. When he helped lift food from the trench, he did so with care, as if each piece were not just nourishment, but time itself. He asked fewer questions, but when he did, they were thoughtful ones, rooted in cause and consequence. One night, as wind howled and snow pressed hard against the unfinished walls, she lay awake listening, not to the storm, but to the absence of certain sounds. No laughter drifted through the settlement now, no idle conversation carried on the wind. What remained was the quiet of endurance, the kind that stripped people down to essentials. She thought again of summer, of the hours spent digging while others built, of the looks she endured, the certainty with which she had been judged. None of that mattered now. Winter was the only judge that counted, and it was rendering its verdict slowly, day by day. By the time the cold reached its deepest point, there was no doubt left in the settlement. Houses still stood, solid and unyielding, but food had become scarce. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Warmth could be maintained with effort and wood. Hunger could not be negotiated with. And beneath the snow, hidden and unremarkable, the trench continued to do what it had been built to do. Water flowed in, water flowed out, and between those movements lay the difference between those who endured and those who merely waited. The first request did not come in the form of words. It came as a presence, hesitant and uncertain. Standing at the edge of the path, she and the boy had cleared through the snow. She noticed it from the corner of her eye while returning from the trench. A figure lingering where the settlement's open ground met the quiet around her unfinished house. The man did not call out. He did not wave. He simply stood there, hands tucked into his coat, shoulders drawn inward against the cold in a way that spoke of more than temperature. She continued walking at the same pace, as if she had not seen him at all. Only when she reached her door and set down what she was carrying did she turn back. He had not moved. The distance between them remained, filled with snow and silence. When he finally spoke, it was not a plea. It was an observation, awkwardly framed, about how she seemed to manage better than most this winter. He spoke of the cold as if it were the main enemy, carefully avoiding mention of what lay beneath his words. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she nodded once. There was no invitation, no dismissal. He left a moment later, his shoulders slumped slightly, as though the act of speaking had taken more from him than the cold itself. After that, they came more frequently, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, always with the same cautious approach. They did not cross the invisible boundary around her house without permission. They stood where they could retreat easily if turned away. Pride still clung to them, even now, even when hunger had begun to hollow their faces and slow their movements. She did not rush to answer any of them. She understood what they were asking before they asked it. The trench beneath the snow had become something more than a storage system. It had become a measure by which the settlement now judged its own decisions. To acknowledge her success was to acknowledge their failure, and that was a step few were ready to take openly. When she did speak, it was with the same calm she brought to every task. She did not offer charity. She offered balance, food in exchange for work when spring came, help now, cooperation later, not as punishment, not as leverage, but as structure. Winter would not last forever, but its consequences would, and the settlement would need more than food to recover. Some resisted at first. They argued quietly that she had more than she needed, that survival should not come with conditions. She listened to these arguments as patiently as she listened to the wind, letting them pass without response. Others understood immediately. They nodded, relief and shame mixing in equal measure, and accepted what she proposed without protest. The boy watched all of this closely. He stood beside her when people came, silent and observant. He saw how her posture never changed, how she did not soften her terms, but also did not harden her heart. He saw the way people's eyes shifted when they realized she was not seeking gratitude, only responsibility. It was a lesson he would carry long after winter ended. Food began to leave the trench more often now. Each time, it was done deliberately. She measured what could be spared without endangering what she and the boy would need until thaw. Nothing was taken impulsively. Nothing was given without thought. The trench, once a private safeguard, became a quiet anchor for the settlement, though it remained physically hidden beneath snow and earth. The act of sharing changed the tone of the place. The desperation that had crept in during the deepest cold did not vanish, but it eased. Fires burned more steadily. People moved with a little more purpose. Meals, though still modest, became something other than a source of dread. The settlement began to breathe again, shallowly at first, but undeniably. Work resumed even in winter's grip. People who had once spent their days indoors, guarding dwindling supplies, now found reasons to step outside. They cleared snow from paths, repaired damage to roofs and walls, and planned for the work that would come once the ground softened. The promise of food gave shape to the future in a way warmth alone never could. Her house, still unfinished, became a point of quiet focus. Those who had accepted her terms understood that helping her complete it would be part of the bargain when spring arrived. Some began to prepare for that work already, salvaging materials, setting aside tools. It was an unspoken agreement, carried forward by action rather than words. Winter did not release its hold easily. Storms came late, heavy with snow that pressed against walls and buried landmarks. The trench endured them all. She checked it daily, sometimes twice, breaking ice, listening for the movement beneath. The boy accompanied her whenever he could, his steps sure now, his movements confident. He had grown into the rhythm of this life, shaped by preparation rather than reaction. There were moments, rare but sharp, when exhaustion threatened to undo her resolve. Nights when the cold inside the house seemed to seep into her bones, when the weight of responsibility pressed harder than the snow on the roof. In those moments, she reminded herself of what they had already survived, of the proof held quietly beneath the earth, of the fact that spring, though distant, was inevitable. The first signs came subtly. The quality of light shifted, growing longer in the afternoons. Snow, once brittle and dry, began to soften at the edges. Water sounded different beneath the ice, more insistent, less restrained. She adjusted the outflow channel again, anticipating what melt would bring. Control now mattered as much as it had in autumn, perhaps more. As days lengthened, the settlement changed with them. People spoke more freely again, though laughter returned slowly, cautiously. Plans for spring were no longer abstract. They were specific, grounded in tasks and timelines. Fields would need clearing, fences repairing, houses finishing. The work would be immense, but it would be shared. The boy sensed the shift as keenly as anyone. He asked questions now about what would come next, about how the trench would be handled once the ground thawed, about what could be built differently the next time. His questions were not born of fear, but of curiosity shaped by experience. He had learned, through cold and effort, that preparation was not a one-time act, but a way of thinking. When the first true thaw arrived, it did so quietly, as winter had. Snow receded from exposed surfaces, revealing dark, wet earth beneath. The trench emerged gradually, its outline reappearing as if summoned rather than uncovered. Water flowed more freely now, carrying with it the scent of soil and renewal. The barrels remained steady, their purpose fulfilled. She took inventory carefully, noting what remained, what had been used, what had carried them through. The calculation was precise and deeply satisfying. Nothing had been wasted. Nothing had failed. The system had done exactly what it was meant to do, carrying them from abundance to scarcity and back toward possibility. Work on her house began almost immediately. People arrived with tools and materials, some from obligation, others from genuine gratitude, though few spoke of it directly. Walls were reinforced, gaps sealed, a proper roof finished at last. The house that had stood as a symbol of misplaced priorities now became evidence of something else entirely, that survival was not about appearances, but about order. As spring took hold, the settlement itself seemed to breathe more deeply. The worst had passed, not because winter had been gentle, but because preparation had been sufficient. People spoke differently now when they spoke of the coming year. There was less bravado, less certainty that strength alone could conquer the land. In its place was a quieter respect for balance, for foresight, for the unseen work that mattered most. The boy stood one afternoon at the edge of the trench, now fully visible, watching water move freely through its length. He understood, in a way that no explanation could have given him, what that narrow channel represented. Not cleverness, not defiance, but the simple truth that life depended on choices made long before their consequences were felt. She joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder, as she had months before. The land around them was changing, softening, opening itself to new work. Behind them stood a finished house at last, solid and ready. Beneath their feet lay the quiet structure that had carried them through the hardest months. Spring had begun long before the snow melted. It had begun in winter, beneath the earth, in cold water guided carefully through stone and soil. And it had proven, beyond doubt, that survival was not built in moments of crisis, but in the steady, unremarkable decisions made when there was still time to choose differently. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are already waiting, and new ones are coming soon. Watch the next video to continue exploring lives shaped by difficult choices and quiet strength. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who would understand it too.